Before the official HOA meeting even began, my personal hell arrived in the form of a navy blazer and a pair of aggressively pleated khakis. Richard Dick Kensington III. The third was important, he insisted, whenever introducing himself, as if anyone could possibly mistake him for any other Dick Kensington. He was a man who clearly peaked in high school, a walking, talking embodiment of every negative stereotype about HOA presidents, the kind of guy who probably alphabetized his spice rack and reported illegally parked cars for fun. He had the permanent sneer of a man who smelled something unpleasant, and a voice that could curdle milk. And, unfortunately for me, he was heading straight in my direction. "Ah, Mr. Peterson," he said, his voice dripping with a condescending formality that made my teeth ache. "I trust you're enjoying your, aquatic amenity?" The way he said aquatic amenity made it sound like a disease. "It's a pool, Dick," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "And yes, I am enjoying it. Very much." He sniffed, a sound that conveyed both disapproval and a deep-seated envy. "Well, I'm afraid I have some concerning news regarding said amenity." He paused, drawing out the moment, clearly relishing his position of power. He produced a manila folder, as if it contained top-secret nuclear launch codes, rather than a petty complaint about my swimming pool. "The board has received numerous complaints about the aesthetic incompatibility of your pool with the overall character of Sunridge Estates." I blinked. "Aesthetic incompatibility?" "Indeed," he said, drawing himself up to his full, unimpressive height. "It's modern, excessively so. It simply doesn't conform." He practically spat the word conform. It was clear that conformity was Dick Kensington's highest ideal. The very concept was delivered with a slight smile, taking clear joy in using his position to crush some joy. The HOA meeting was held, as always, in the soul-crushingly beige community center. The air hung heavy with the scent of stale coffee and simmering resentment. Folding chairs scraped against the linoleum floor as the residents of Sunridge Estates, a collection of mostly middle-aged and entirely conformist individuals, settled in for their monthly dose of bureaucratic tyranny. Dick Kensington III, gavel in hand, of course he had a gavel, called the meeting to order. After a tedious reading of the minutes from the previous meeting, which included a heated debate about the acceptable color of mailbox flags, the floor was opened for new business. A parade of pettiness ensued. Mrs. Gable, again, complained about the neighbors' wind chimes, claiming they were disrupting the natural tranquility of the neighborhood. Mr. Henderson was reprimanded for allowing his roses to grow too vigorously, their blooms exceeding the HOA-approved height limit by a scandalous 2 inches. It was all utterly ridiculous. Then came the main event. Dick, with a theatrical flourish, announced the pressing issue of my pool. "As you all know," he said, his voice oozing with disdain, "Mr. Peterson has installed a swimming pool in his backyard. A pool that, I might add, is starkly modern in its design." He said modern like it was a contagious disease. It clashes violently with the traditional colonial aesthetic of our community. It's an eyesore. It's disruptive. "Disruptive? It's a pool, Dick. People swim in it." "It's not a nuclear power plant," I thought, my internal monologue growing increasingly sarcastic. He went on to claim that it was lowering property values, a blatant lie, and attracting unwanted attention, unless you count the occasional envious glance from a passing neighbor. The reasoning was so flimsy, so obviously fabricated, that I could barely contain my outrage. I looked around the room, hoping for some support, some sign of sanity. But the other homeowners, a sea of beige and khaki, were mostly silent, their eyes downcast. A few nodded along with Dick, their faces carefully neutral. They were spineless, utterly cowed by Dick's petty authority. A wave of anger, disbelief, and, yes, a growing sense of rebellious defiance washed over me. This wasn't just about my pool anymore. This was about principle. This was about the right to enjoy my own damn property without being harassed by a power-tripping, aesthetically obsessed dictator. And I was not going to back down. Back in my backyard, staring at the offending pool, which, frankly, looked beautiful in the afternoon sun, I wrestled with my options. I could go the conventional route. I could circulate a petition, gather signatures, and try to fight the HOA through their own Byzantine rules. I could hire a lawyer, file an appeal, and engage in a protracted legal battle. I could fight this the normal way, lawyers, meetings, endless paperwork, but honestly, who has the energy? Dealing with Dick Kensington is like arguing with a brick wall, a smug, self-righteous brick wall with a gavel. The thought of spending months, maybe even years, embroiled in a soul-sucking bureaucratic war filled me with a profound sense of weariness. I'd probably win, eventually, but at what cost? My gaze drifted from the pool to the house itself. My house. My modern house. The house that so clearly offended Dick Kensington's delicate sensibilities. And that's when it hit me. A slow, simmering idea, born of frustration and fueled by a healthy dose of spite. If they hated the pool because it was modern, because it didn't fit their narrow definition of acceptable, then maybe, just maybe, I should lean into that. I should embrace the modern. I should do something so audacious, so over the top, so completely and utterly untraditional that it would make Dick Kensington's head explode. A slow grin spread across my face. This wasn't just about saving my pool anymore. This was about sending a message. This was about striking a blow for architectural freedom, for personal expression, for the right to be gloriously, unapologetically different. Fine. They want traditional. They want aesthetic. I'll give them aesthetic. I'll give them something they'll never forget. The next few days were a whirlwind of clandestine research and hushed phone calls. I dove headfirst into the world of rooftop pools, a world I hadn't even known existed until now. I quickly discovered that this wasn't something you could just slap together with some plywood and a tarp. This required expertise. So I started contacting architects. Not just any architects, mind you. I needed the kind of architects who laughed in the face of building codes, the kind who saw structural limitations as mere suggestions. These weren't your average deck and patio guys. These were people who designed pools for sheiks and movie stars, people who considered gravity a mere suggestion. My first call was to a firm in Los Angeles that specialized in extreme architecture. I spoke to a woman named Astrid, who had a voice like gravel and a portfolio that included a cantilevered pool hanging off the side of a cliff. She seemed intrigued by my project, if slightly underwhelmed by the suburban setting. A rooftop infinity pool in Sunridge Estates? She asked, her voice laced with a hint of disbelief. Darling, are you sure they're ready for that level of fabulous? They're about to find out, I replied, with a newfound confidence. I contacted several other firms, each one more eccentric than the last. I received proposals that included underwater sound systems, holographic projections, and even a retractable glass roof. It was all incredibly over the top, and I loved it. Meanwhile, I had to keep my plans completely under wraps. When neighbors asked about the increased activity around my house, I'd offer vague explanations. Just some renovations, I'd say, with a knowing smile. Making some improvements. Mrs. Higgins, ever vigilant, eyed me with suspicion, but I managed to deflect her inquiries with a combination of carefully worded non-answers and a strategically placed distraction, a particularly flamboyant garden gnome, borrowed from Mr. Henderson. The secrecy only added to the thrill. It felt like I was planning a covert operation, a suburban coup d'etat, with a rooftop pool as my weapon of choice. With architectural plans in hand, Astrid had surprisingly delivered, I embarked on the next, and arguably most daunting phase of my operation, obtaining the necessary building permits. This meant navigating the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the city planning department, a place where dreams went to die, suffocated by red tape and endless paperwork. I spent hours filling out forms, answering questions about drainage, structural integrity, and load-bearing walls. I had to submit detailed schematics, engineering reports, and environmental impact assessments. It was a tedious, mind-numbing process, a stark contrast to the audacious project I was undertaking. The irony of filling out endless forms about drainage and load-bearing walls, all while planning to build a pool on my roof, was not lost on me. It felt like applying for a library card while simultaneously plotting to steal the Mona Lisa. The city inspectors, understandably, seemed a bit bewildered by my application. One of them, a man named Bob with a permanent frown and a coffee stain on his tie, squinted at the blueprints for a long time. "You're putting a pool where?" he asked, his voice laced with skepticism. "On the roof," I replied, with a confidence I didn't entirely feel. "Right," he said slowly. "And why?" "Because I can," I almost said. Instead, I mumbled something about maximizing space and enhancing property value. To my astonishment, and possibly Bob's as well, the permits were approved. I suspect it was a combination of Astrid's impeccable engineering, my meticulous adherence to the building codes, however absurd they seemed in this context, and perhaps a touch of sheer bureaucratic bewilderment. Whatever the reason, I had the green light. Operation Sky Pool was officially a go. The arrival of the construction crew was like a scene from a disaster movie, only instead of an alien invasion, it was a rooftop pool. Giant cranes, flatbed trucks loaded with steel beams, and enough concrete to build a small bunker descended upon my quiet suburban street. The noise was deafening, a constant cacophony of hammering, drilling, and the guttural roar of heavy machinery. My neighbors, understandably, were bewildered. They emerged from their houses, shielding their eyes and staring at the spectacle unfolding in my backyard. Mrs. Higgins, armed with her binoculars, maintained a constant vigil from her window, her expression a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. Even the normally unflappable Mr. Henderson looked slightly unnerved. The construction workers themselves were a source of constant amusement. They were seasoned professionals, hardened veterans of countless building projects, but even they seemed a little intimidated by this one. "You're really putting a pool up there?" the foreman, a burly man named Tony, asked me on the first day, pointing towards my roof with a calloused hand. "That's the plan," I replied, trying to project an air of calm confidence. "Huh," he said, shaking his head. "Never seen anything like it. You got balls, I'll give you that." Throughout the construction process, I'd overhear snippets of their conversations. "This guy's either a genius or a complete lunatic," one worker would say. "Probably both," another would reply. The HOA, of course, started sniffing around. Dick Kensington III himself paid me a visit, his face contorted in a mask of barely suppressed rage. "What, pray tell, is going on here, Mr. Peterson?" he demanded, his voice tight with suspicion. "Just some structural enhancements, Dick," I replied, with a vague wave of my hand. "Improving the integrity of the roof." He narrowed his eyes. "It looks an awful lot like you're building something. Up there." I smiled, a slow, knowing smile that I'd been practicing in the mirror. "Just wait and see, Dick. Just wait and see." My cryptic responses, combined with the sheer scale of the construction, seemed to confuse and frustrate him in equal measure. He left, muttering darkly about violations and aesthetics, but without any concrete evidence to support his suspicions. The game, as they say, was afoot. The day of the grand reveal arrived with the fanfare of a Hollywood premiere. The construction crew, after weeks of tireless work and a healthy dose of bewildered amusement, had finally finished. The scaffolding, which had shrouded my house like a giant metallic cocoon, was ready to come down. A small crowd had gathered on the street, a mixture of curious neighbors, bewildered onlookers, and, of course, the ever-vigilant Mrs. Higgins, binoculars firmly glued to her eyes. Dick Kensington III stood at the edge of my property, his arms crossed, his face a mask of simmering resentment. With a dramatic flourish and a lot of grunting from the construction workers, the scaffolding was dismantled piece by piece, revealing my masterpiece to the world. There it was, my rooftop infinity pool. And it was glorious. It was like a slice of Vegas had been airlifted onto my roof. It was audacious, it was ridiculous, and it was beautiful. The water, crystal clear and shimmering in the afternoon sun, cascaded over the infinity edge, creating a mesmerizing waterfall effect. A section of the pool floor was made of thick, reinforced glass, offering a dizzying view of the ground below. At night, programmable LED lights would illuminate the water, transforming the pool into a glowing, multicolored spectacle. It was a monument to excess, a testament to the power of spite, and a giant middle finger to the HOA, all rolled into one magnificent aquatic package. The reaction from the crowd was immediate and varied. There were gasps of awe, murmurs of disbelief, and from some outright expressions of jealousy. Mrs. Higgins lowered her binoculars, her mouth agape. Mr. Henderson let out a low whistle of appreciation. Even Dick Kensington III, for a brief moment, seemed speechless, his carefully constructed facade of disapproval crumbling under the weight of the sheer, over-the-top spectacle. I, meanwhile, wasted no time. I climbed the newly installed spiral staircase leading to my rooftop oasis, stripped down to my swimming trunks, and dove in. The water was cool and refreshing, the feeling of weightlessness exhilarating. I swam to the edge, gazing out over the neighborhood, feeling like a king surveying his kingdom. My kingdom of watery defiance. It was, without a doubt, the most satisfying swim of my life. The peace of my inaugural swim was shattered by a sound that could only be described as a strangled yelp. It was Dick Kensington III, and he looked like he was about to spontaneously combust. He stormed across my lawn, his face a shade of purple usually reserved for eggplants, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. He stopped at the edge of my property, his gaze fixed on the rooftop pool with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. "What have you done?" he bellowed, his voice cracking with rage. He pointed a trembling finger towards the pool, as if accusing it of some heinous crime. This is an abomination. It's a monstrosity. It's un-American." I calmly swam to the edge of the pool, the water cascading over the infinity edge in a soothing, almost mocking rhythm. "I believe the term is architectural marvel, Dick," I said, drying my face with a fluffy towel. "Or perhaps aquatic masterpiece?" I offered him a beatific smile, the kind you give to small children and particularly dense adults. "Don't you get smart with me, Peterson," he sputtered, flecks of spittle flying from his mouth. This thing violates every rule in the HOA handbook. It's tacky." "Tacky? Coming from the man who wears a navy blazer with khaki pants?" That's rich, I thought. I assure you, Dick, I said, maintaining my composure, everything is perfectly legal. I have all the necessary permits. The structure is sound. The city inspectors have signed off on it. The city inspectors are idiots, he roared. This swimming pool on your roof is a blight on the landscape. It's a public nuisance. I leaned back against the edge of the pool, enjoying the show. Watching Dick Kensington sputter and foam at the mouth was almost as satisfying as the pool itself. Almost. You'll be hearing from my lawyer, he finally managed to choke out, his face now a truly alarming shade of crimson. I look forward to it, I replied, with genuine enthusiasm. My lawyer's very excited about this, actually. He loves a good loophole. And trust me, Dick, there are plenty of loopholes when it comes to rooftop pools in Sunridge Estates. I gave him another dazzling smile, the kind that promised a long, drawn-out, and ultimately futile legal battle. He turned and stomped away, his navy blazer flapping in the breeze, a defeated, deflated dictator. The first round, decisively, went to me. The following days were a masterclass in bureaucratic futility, courtesy of the Sunridge Estates HOA. They threw everything they had at me, every obscure bylaw, every vaguely worded regulation, every loophole they could misinterpret. But every attempt to shut down my rooftop paradise was met with a swift, decisive, and legally sound rebuttal. First, they tried to claim the pool was a structure exceeding the maximum allowable height. Dave, my lawyer friend, calmly pointed out that the height restriction applied to the house itself, not to any decorative architectural features on the roof. He even produced a photograph of Dick Kensington's own oversized, ridiculously ornate weather vane, which technically violated the height restriction more than my pool did. Next, they argued that the pool was a noise nuisance, citing the excessive splashing sounds. Dave countered with a decibel reading taken from inside Dick's house, proving that the splashing was barely audible above the ambient noise of the neighborhood, and significantly quieter than Mrs. Gable's wind chimes. Then, they tried to claim the pool was a safety hazard, suggesting that it might collapse and flood the entire neighborhood. Dave produced engineering reports, stamped and signed by Astrid, proving that the structure could withstand a hurricane, a small earthquake, and possibly even a direct meteor strike. Their attempts grew increasingly desperate and pathetic. They tried to claim the pool was attracting undesirable wildlife. The ducks, apparently, were now a threat. They even tried to argue that the shimmering blue water was distracting to drivers. Each challenge was met with a gleeful, almost theatrical takedown by Dave, who seemed to be enjoying this even more than I was. He'd fax over his responses, complete with sarcastic footnotes and legal citations that made my head spin. It was a beautiful thing to behold. The HOA was flailing, drowning in a sea of legal technicalities, and I was happily floating above it all, in my perfectly legal, perfectly outrageous rooftop pool. The emergency HOA meeting, called by a clearly panicked Dick Kensington III, was a scene of glorious, unadulterated chaos. The beige community center, usually a haven of stifling order, was buzzing with a mixture of anger, confusion, and, surprisingly, a touch of grudging admiration. Dick, looking even more disheveled than usual, stood at the front of the room, his gavel banging frantically against the podium. This is an outrage, he sputtered, his voice hoarse. Peterson's monstrosity is a direct assault on the values of Sunridge Estates. We must do something. But his usual authority was gone. The members, usually so compliant, were restless and divided. The air was thick with whispers and murmurs. Well, it is kind of impressive, Mr. Henderson mumbled, earning a sharp glare from Dick. I heard it increased property values, Mrs. Gable chimed in. surprisingly, given her past history of complaints. "My grandkids saw it on the internet," another resident added. "They think it's the coolest thing ever." Dick tried to regain control, launching into a rambling speech about architectural integrity and community standards, but his words fell flat. He was a general without an army, a dictator facing a rebellion. Some members were openly questioning his leadership, suggesting that maybe, just maybe, the HOA had overreacted. Others were secretly, or not so secretly, admiring my audacity, my sheer, unmitigated gall in defying the established order. The meeting devolved into a shouting match, with accusations flying back and forth, bylaws being misinterpreted, and Robert's rules of order being completely ignored. Dick's gavel, once a symbol of power, was now just a useless piece of wood, banging in vain against the rising tide of dissent. The meeting ended in disarray, with no clear resolution, no plan of action, and a palpable sense of the HOA's impending doom. Dick Kensington III, the once mighty ruler of Sunridge Estates, was left standing alone, defeated and deflated, in the middle of a beige, bureaucratic battlefield. My house, or rather my rooftop pool, had become a local sensation. People would drive by slowly, craning their necks, pointing, and taking pictures. It was like living inside a bizarre suburban tourist attraction. Weekends were particularly busy, with a steady stream of cars cruising past, their occupants gawking at my aquatic masterpiece. Social media, of course, exploded. Pictures and videos of the pool went viral, accompanied by a flurry of comments ranging from "OMG, I want one," to "This is the most insane thing I've ever seen," to "HOAs are the worst." Local news outlets picked up the story, dubbing it the Sky Pool, and interviewing bewildered neighbors, and a very smug me. The general consensus was one of amused admiration. I had, inadvertently, become a local legend, a symbol of rebellion against the tyranny of conformity. The online comments were particularly entertaining. One user wrote, "This guy's living in 3023 while the HOA is stuck in 1953. Another commented, "I bet the HOA president's head exploded when he saw this. Glorious!" And my personal favorite, "This is the kind of petty revenge I live for." It seemed the entire internet was rooting for me. Then came the ultimate irony. Real estate agents, those opportunistic vultures, started using my rooftop pool as a selling point for the entire neighborhood. "Live in the prestigious Sunridge Estates," their listings would proclaim. "Home of the famous Sky Pool." Houses that had been languishing on the market for months suddenly started receiving multiple offers. The very thing the HOA had claimed would decrease property values, my monstrosity, my abomination, was actually increasing them. Dick Kensington III's logic had been turned on its head, and I was reaping the unintended benefits. The sheer poetic justice of it all was almost too much to bear. Even old Mr. Abernathy, my notoriously grumpy neighbor who'd initially complained about the unsightly construction, had a change of heart. He'd been one of the most vocal opponents of the pool, grumbling about eyesores and the decline of Western civilization. One afternoon, I found him standing at the edge of my property, gazing up at the pool with a wistful expression. "So about that swim," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. I couldn't resist. "I'm sorry, Mr. Abernathy," I said with a perfectly straight face. "The pool is for residents only, and well, you know, HOA rules." He looked at me, a flicker of understanding, and perhaps even a hint of admiration in his eyes. "But I am a resident," he pointed out, a little weakly. "Ah, yes," I said. "But this pool has special rules, you see, implemented after recent events. Only current HOA members are allowed." I paused for dramatic effect. Unless things change. He sighed. The message was clear. The power had shifted. The pool, once a source of contention, was now a symbol of my victory, a bargaining chip, a very wet and very visible testament to the HOA's defeat. And then the floodgates opened. Inspired by my example, other homeowners in Sunridge Estates started applying for permits to build their own rooftop pools. It was like a domino effect, a wave of aquatic rebellion sweeping through the neighborhood. The designs became increasingly outlandish. Mr. Henderson, freed from his gnome-related restrictions, applied for a permit to build a rooftop lazy river. Mrs. Gable wanted a pool shaped like a giant paw print in honor of her, now excessively loud, Chihuahua. The rich guy down the street, not to be outdone, proposed a mini water park, complete with slides, waterfalls, and a swim-up bar. The HOA, already reeling from my victory, was completely overwhelmed. They were drowning in a sea of paperwork, permit requests, and increasingly bizarre architectural plans. Dick Kensington's carefully constructed world of beige conformity was collapsing around him. And then came the final exquisite blow. I overheard Mrs. Kensington, Dick's own wife, talking to a friend at the grocery store. "You know," she said, loud enough for everyone in the frozen food aisle to hear, "I've been thinking, an infinity pool on our roof would be rather nice, wouldn't it? It would certainly add value to the property." Dick resigned the next day. His letter of resignation, a single crumpled sheet of paper, simply read, "I quit." He'd been broken, utterly and completely, by the wave of rooftop aquatic rebellion that I had unleashed. The HOA, leaderless and demoralized, effectively ceased to exist as a force of oppression. Sunridge Estates, once a bastion of stifling conformity, was on its way to becoming the rooftop pool capital of suburbia. And it was all thanks to me, my spite, and a very, very good architect.